Thanks, Marco Luca and Lucia for hosting us, Sanya for coordinating this series of seminars, and everyone for joining. So today, our guest is connected with us from Trieste because finally there was no possibility to travel to Rijeka, although the two cities are really close to each other. But anyhow, we're used to this mixed modality for thinking together by now. So I'm sure we can make the most out of this very great day. And anyway, I'm very pleased to have Pantxo with us because aside from the fact that he's a very dear person and friend to me, but also I think he's one of the people that is connecting in various ways a lot of important conversations around how to reimagine instituent practices in various at various levels and in various configurations of practices. I would say at the level of social movements, at the level of artistic practice, and archival building, but also and perhaps very importantly right now around notions. So rethinking instituting as an ongoing effort to sustain care. I think that could be a general introduction to some of the themes that traverse his work. Just to say a little bit more for the also the recording and the other listeners. So Pantxo Ramas has a background, an academic background in social sciences, political economy, and urban studies. And he participated in various European and Latin American social movements, as well as having some experience at the local public policy level. And so his research focuses on the possibilities and transformations of care practices in contemporary context. Just to mention perhaps a couple of recent research projects he has been involved with. First is I like to mention as being looking at the artistic practices that accompanied the Basaglian revolution of deinstitutionalization of mental health care in Trieste. So he has created this really interesting archive that lives online called Palinsesto Basagliano, and the link is also in our website. That covers basically the practices of photography, urban art, theater, visual arts, and design that kind of traversed the experience of kind of rethinking radically what care for mental health could look like. And then a second project I'd like to mention quickly was a collective research project called Entrare Fuori, or Entrar Afuera in Spanish, which is also the title of the website in case you want to Google it. And this work focused more on the institutional transformations in care and health across Europe. So it's a kind of collaborative study with local authorities and cultural institutions also in Spain, such as the city of Madrid, the Museo Nacional Centro de Arte Reina Sofía, and also the regional institute of, which is called Azienda Sanitaria Universitaria Integrata, it's a very long name, Giuliano Isontina in Friuli, which is the regional entity that takes care of organizing healthcare in Italy, is regionally instituted. So this is around Trieste area in Friuli. All right, so we're gonna hear today his talk, which is aptly titled "The Legacy of Basaglian Deinstitutionalization of Mental Health Care," and then we will have our conversations as we get along. Yeah, so over to you, Pantxo, and welcome to the group.
Thank you. I hope you hear me well, and the connection will not make problems to us. Let me know if there is any problem, so I can find a better spot in my place.
Which is broadly what he will address today. One reminder, sorry, I would ask everyone to just keep your videos off as well as your audio, because we had some issues with the connection earlier. So hopefully that might help. Okay, ciao Pantxo.
Okay, so I will try to tell you a bit of the story of Trieste and what's happening, and then we might try to have a conversation through issues that are relevant to your work, because this is a difficult moment here in Trieste, and so it is useful to define a dialogue with other instances that can help us to think through the moment of dangers. I was trying to start from the beginning, in the sense that the history of Trieste as a process of deinstitutionalization in mental health care starts in 1971, 50 years ago. But the asylum was opened in 1908 in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and was the attempt of building an institution which would transform the logic of mental health care of the 19th century. In the 19th century, you have this logic of containment and repression upon the body of the insane. In the early 20th century, in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, there is the attempt of building what later Goffman called the total institution, which was nonetheless a utopia of building a nice place, a place of serenity, of calmness, where people could find their logic back in their life. Although this paradigm of psychiatry, this epistemology, was based on the logic of a normalcy, of a discipline of the body and of the mind, that immediately got rotten, in the sense that you have to think that we are talking about the beginning of the 20th century. We are talking about the area of Trieste, and so just 5 years, 7 years after the opening of the asylum, the First World War starts here, and all the violence of it are both have an impact on the asylum, in the sense that the asylum becomes a place where to host people that is exiled, that is coming through the different borders of the Eastern region. And we all know how complex and violent is this history, especially in this time. But also there is a convergence of the logic of eugenetics and concentration, in which I would say psychiatry is an experimental field that later goes into fascism and Nazism and all over Europe in the long World War that starts in 15 and ends in 45. This is not just a conceptual parallel, because it is also a biographical one. Franco Basaglia, who is a psychiatrist which was born in the early 30s, lives through the Second World War as an anti-fascist, and is detained in jail as an anti-fascist, so that when he arrives in the asylum, he recognizes himself in the inmates of the asylum as through his experience of detention, through that experience of the limitation of freedom. And in a sense, the idea of deinstitutionalizing the space of the asylum is the effort of affirming, of continuing an anti-fascist struggle, and the construction of a full right of citizenship, a full experience of what citizenship means. We are talking of the 70s. Actually, in the 60s, it starts in Gorizia, and then in the 70s in Trieste. And I think one title of one of the books is very interesting in this sense, which is Peacetime Crimes. If there were wartime crimes, which was the violence of the war, what Basaglia says in the 70s, that the total institutions are the peacetime crime. So is the continuation of that logic of war in terms of in times of peace. And therefore, our attempt of thinking through institution or thinking through the welfare state is the attempt of deinstitutionalizing what is the fascist legacy that still lives in public institutions. I think this is something very contemporary in a sense, the way in which we are seeing today even all the pandemic context, we see this tension between an individualism of care and an authoritarianism of the state. So what happens in the 70s is that the attempt is that of denying the organization, the logic of organization of the asylum. The asylum, you have to think, was organized by dangerousness. And so the organization of the pavilions in the asylum was organized by the way in which the body should be contained. The way in which this starts to be reorganized during the Basaglian experience is by territory, by neighborhood. So every pavilion, instead of having a certain kind of diagnostic, starts to be organized by who was living where and how to reconnect their life in the asylum to their life in the public space of the city. Why that? Because the idea is that of rebuilding that connection in order to move the people out of the institution and back into the social life, and therefore of moving the services, the practices of care out of the total institution and back into the social life. It is interesting to me the fact that one of the first actions that the Basaglian equipe organizes in the 70s is that of buying cars. So buying cars in order to allow the equipes of care of going into the neighborhood, of being able to know what are the bars, the social centers, the cultural spaces that exist in the neighborhoods, and therefore really meant a possibility of life for those that were contained in the asylum. So in a sense, the possibility of denying the total institution, what is being called the denied institution of the 70s, so the conceptual and practical critique of the total institution cannot live without another effort, the effort of inventing new forms of institution, the instituent dimension that Valeria was mentioning before. So the logic of it becomes that of building new institutional forms. There is a text of 75 which I think is very interesting and is connected to many of the things we have been discussing with Valeria about the struggles in the 70s in Italy. In Italy, there were a lot of as all over the world in the aftermath of the 68. In Italy, there was a very strong working class struggles in the early 70s, and many doctors were experimenting with the idea of escaping from the institution and starts to work with the social. And this is something that is very interesting on a number of levels. All the work in the factories in Turin, for example, is very significant in this sense. But in Trieste, the attempt was a different one, not necessarily an antagonistic one to that, but surely a radically different one, which was how to take a certain responsibility of care, a certain responsibility of discipline, of knowledge, into the complexity of social life. And so to think how the institution can stand in the complexity of life and therefore put itself at risk in this life. So the doctor is not just the one that says to the patient, you should take your medicine or you should have a nice walk in order to be more calm, but also has to look at where the person lives, if she can walk down the stairs of the place where she lives, and therefore actually look at the social determinants of health, as they have been named afterwards, but also what are the political determinants of health, in the sense of what is the access to the right of to housing rights, to labor rights, to social rights, to an intimacy, to an erotic. All this dimension of life must be the interlocution of a mental health care practice. So a practice that gets away from the logic of psychiatry as in itself and starts to live with the life of the city. Two examples can be very, or three can be very interesting to understand what this means. What means to invent institutions? First, it means to invent new places for care. So not anymore the asylum in Trieste, which was on the top of the hill in the periphery of the city, but do a double movement there. On the one hand, starts to occupy, radically occupy, because there were illegal squatting, the way in which the first mental health care center were opened in the city, and then negotiated with the public authorities in order to make them become part of the official system of mental health care. So invent new places where the practice must be different, because you are involved in the life of the city, in the life of not only the person that is in charge to the mental health care system, but also the difficulties of social life that that neighborhood is living. And then to invent other two levels, which is levels of expressive laboratories, so arts, and on the other hand, of a different entry to the contradiction of labor. I was talking a few days ago with a worker that she was working in a mental health care center in the early 70s, and she was telling me a story that I think is very, very interesting. And we were talking with Valeria just a few days ago, and after that we had I had this other conversation, and another story came out in which but it's a recurrent one, in which when the mental health care center started to work in the city, also the users started to be inserted in factories, for example, to work. And there was a strong connection between the workers of the mental health care center with the unions in the factories, in order to accompany, to make it possible to have this inclusion in labor. And most of the time, what was happening to this inclusion of people with difficulties in labor environments was that a number of mental health care issues of the population in general, of the workers in general, were appearing very strongly, and also that this quality of perception of the fragile people, the frail people, the people that was included into the labor market, were defining new demands of the union, not only for the person that was in difficulty, but also for the union, for the factory in general. So this is the first level that I think is very interesting, the way in which the passage of working from the asylum into the territory not only means to look at the person in her full dimension of life, but also to recognize that the population of a certain neighborhood has a claim, a demand towards the mental health care system. And so the mental health care system must not just deal with the question of the psychiatric problem of the person, but more in general as to deal with the mental health care of a certain territory. And so on the top of this, two big levels come through. First is how to reorganize the space of the asylum, how to give back these pavilions, parks, gardens, etc., to the city, which means destigmatize the space and make it available for the people. And this happens in the 80s in a very interesting way, because the people that starts to occupy the abandoned pavilions of the asylum are the countercultures of Trieste. So where in Milan, which is the city where I was born in the 80s, the social center movement starts to be the place that occupies abandoned places and organizes a new wave of cultural practice, in Trieste is very clear how the fact that the mental health care system puts the former asylum to the disposal of the city allows a dynamic and powerful connection between, on the one hand, the countercultures that starts to occupy the pavilions and the machinery of the former asylum, and the fact that people, the loonies, are always included and always participants, active participants in this space. I will make you a very small but I think interesting example about this. In 1984-85, the director of the mental health care system in that period buys a few photocopy machine for the administrative necessities of the mental health care system, but also he allows the arts laboratories to use these photocopy machines in order to make their arts. So this is the way in which, through which Xerox art, which was happening in New York and all around the world, arrives in Trieste, because the director of the mental health care system put that machine at disposal of the art laboratory, Laboratorio P, which was one pavilion. The pavilion were named by letters, so A, B, C, D, F, etc. And the laboratory, the pavilion number P, was called Laboratory P and became an art laboratory. But also the fact that this art laboratory started to use the Xerox machine in order to produce their arts allowed a very strong visibility of the countercultures that were happening in the asylum throughout all the city. And the asylum became, from 86 to 93, 94, I would say, a space of raves. Many raves were taking place in the former asylum, and I will send you some footage of that period. It's incredible the way in which you see, I worked through the archive, and so I've been watching images of the 70s and the 80s. You see the same bodies that in the 70s are still constrained by the logic of the exclusion of the space of the asylum into parties that are of the youngster of the 80s, the punk, etc., etc. And that that body that once was normalized by the institution is now allowed to be in permanent connection with an extreme diversity, as the punk movement brings to the space of the asylum, and therefore feel another possibility of being different. Is in this period in which one of the slogans of the Basaglian movement becomes up close, nobody's normal. And this becomes the slogan of t-shirts that starts to be present in all the city, that starts to construct, to build a connection between the space of the asylum and the space of the city. So we have this double movement that Valeria was mentioning before as the title of our research collective. On the one hand, entering outside, so the way in which the services starts to enter outside in the city and be in the city in order to support the complex and difficult life of users once they are living in the city, and therefore putting their own knowledge as doctors at risk in this complexity of social life. And on the other hand, it is an exiting inside. So the fact that everything that is out of normalcy enters in the former space of the asylum and transform it into a machine of radical diversity. This radical diversity in the asylum is, on the one hand, one of the poles, and the other pole is the possibility of a strange, permanently quivering normalcy that stays in life, so that the person that is in charge of the mental health care system is also working in a factory, and the union is in connection with the mental health care center, and this develops a number of possibilities of care. Out of these two poles of normalcy and diversity, another level comes out, which is social cooperation. So the idea that there is the possibility of occupying and intervening in social life and affirming cooperatives as an experimental of a new diagram of production in social life. And so the social cooperatives are the third level of this invention of institution. So we have the first moment is the idea of the total institution, initially as a utopia, but then as the failure of this utopia in the logic of authoritarianism and totalization of life. The second is the denial of this institution, the critique of this institution, the unveiling of the violence of this institution that happens in the 70s. And then in the 80s, I would say this invention that works on three levels: the intervention in the space of the city, the construction of a radical diversity in the formal space of the asylum, and third, the possibility of experimenting with machines of production and social cooperation, which are different than from what exists in reality. The fourth phase that I want to mention you is the phase in which the idea is to say, okay, this model of care, this model of radical care, this model of critique of welfare is not just relevant for mental health care, but must be the paradigm and the logic of welfare in general. And so the construction of healthcare in general as a practice that is territorial, everything that can happen outside of the hospital must happen in the city. So home care, chronic disease, etc., 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 must be constructed not in the safe space of the hospital, a safe space for the doctor, but an unknown and difficult space for the patient. And this logic must of welfare must also touch other levels of public institution, as it is social housing, as it is social services, and so on. And so try to build connection between institutions in order to rebuild the practice of care within the city. This last example is very relevant, is very clear in two levels of intervention. The first is the social healthcare district, so the invention of community spaces in which the specialistic disciplines of hospitals, of medicine, are moved from the hospital to smaller and closer institutional spaces. Rehabilitation after a period of hospitalization, for example, is not anymore constructed in a space that is a residential house where you have your rehabilitation, but is built through a domicile, home care, which reaches levels of great complexity of medical intervention. But also all those diseases, and we know that they are more and more relevant with the aging of population, that are chronic, as it can be diabetes, as it can be other Alzheimer, etc., which are very related to aging, are moved to the social space. And in this sense, one of the examples of this capillary intervention is called the Microarea project. So the idea of building very small institutions that intervene in very small area of 2,000 to 5,000 people, so small neighborhoods in which there is an equipe of public workers from the social housing company, from the social services of the local government, and from the healthcare system, which work together in interconnected and a keep way, and which know person by person everybody that is living in that neighborhood. What happens if you work like that? It happens that I will make you a very collected in one story by Giovanna Gallio, this person that was not in charge to mental health care system because he was depressed, but not so much to be in charge to any service. He was poor, but not poor enough to be in charge of the social services. He was in a difficult housing situation, but not enough to be in charge to the social housing company. But if you put these three together, the situation of his life was unsustainable. He has diabetes. He lived on a 5th floor without lift, and he was depressed. So he wouldn't go out to have a nice walk and buy good food in order to deal and care of his own diabetes, because he was too depressed, and the stairs were too difficult for him. And each of these three institutions, the social housing, the social services, and the mental health care, were saying it is not our duty to deal with you. But once they are working together, they see that the situation, the complexity of the situation calls them to respond to that together, and that the complexity of the situation needs for a public answer and a public investment in order to respond to the situation. So that the fact that the mental health care and the social health care institution recognizes which are the problems related to his housing situation allows to open a new protocol so that the social housing company finds a different apartment where he can live, and so he can have an access to mobility, and therefore to a good quality of food, and therefore a better sociality and less of a depression. I don't know, it's a bit strange because due to the technical issues I cannot see you, and I hope this is making some sort of sense. So if you give me a feedback, I will try to synthesize what I think are some elements that I was telling to Sania, Valeria, and Marco before, which is the way in which okay, we can see these 4 phases, these 4 historical phases, and they are obviously overlapping. The total institution starts to be dismantled already in the 50s, because when the Second World War ends and people come back from the war crazy, obviously you cannot treat them as you were treating the poor and the lumpen proletariat of the 30s in the fascist period. So that the total institution starts to be dismantled by the democratic reinvention of Europe in the 50s. But the denial of the institution starts strongly in the 70s, I was telling you. But this denial of the institution cannot happen without inventing new levels. And this fact that the invention of new levels start to construct a presence in the territory of the city of Trieste implies the fact that you realize, as a social movement, which is the Basaglian revolution, that this is not just a model that is relevant for mental health care, but must be a political effort for care, a radical practice of care with public investment for the general life of the city. But I was telling them, and I'm telling you now, which might be 3 levels that are, some levels that are useful for our discussion now, the fact that I can see 2 vectors, one from top to a top-down vector and a bottom-up vector. The top-down vector implies these 3 critiques. The first is the critique of medicine. So, and especially the critique of the autonomy of medicine as a knowledge. The fact that we have to put, and this is true for all knowledges, I think, from arts to legal studies to everything, the fact that we have to put the knowledge into the spaces in which, on the threshold of his critique, on the threshold of his own crisis, because when the psychiatrist sees the social context of the person of the patient, the person in front of him or in front of her is not anymore a diagnostic, but it's a person that has a problem with life, a problem with families, etc., 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 etc. So first, a critique of medicine. Second, a critique of institution. Or the institution is dismantled again, it's in its own autonomy, or the possibility of changing the logic of intervention cannot happen. And what is the change that must happen? The fact that the institution responds to the matters of the people and not provides a series of services which are preconfigured before the situation of the concrete life of the people. Third, a critique of legality and of legal production. Everything that happens in Trieste, from the creation of mental health care center on the 24 hours until the constitution of my center of documentation in these days, happens before law. So the institution is produced, and then the construction of a certain possibility of a legal recognition for that is built on the social conflict that you produce by the fact that you organize something that is useful and needed, and therefore you call politician and the legal system to allow that to happen. So this is the top-down. A critique of medicine, a critique of institution, a critique of administrative regulation and law, let's say, and the law. But this critique cannot happen without a bottom-up mobilization. And the bottom-up mobilization happens in Trieste at least on 3 different levels, or on 3 different aspects. The first is the fact that the alliance with arts, which is a very long one, and I can go further in that if you have questions. The alliance with arts gives a different capacity of communication, a different possibility of expression, which on the one hand allows the people that was in the asylum not anymore to have art as a therapy, but have arts as a tool of emancipation, of expression, and therefore of emancipation. But also the fact that these communication tools allows a different relationship with the people, with the general public, let's say, with the audience, and produce an active engagement with the social life of the city. So this is the first level. The second, the fact that the presence of services, etc., in the city transform the spaces of the city. The transformation of urban settings is crucial. There is no care, or better said, Franco Rotelli says, in the relationship of care, there is always a third level, which is never neutral, but many times invisible. And this is the setting in which care happens. If the relationship of care of the psychiatrist with the patient can be this hierarchical and univocal relationship only if we are closed in the walls of the asylum. If we are in the life of the city, the setting of the city transforms the relationship of power. So this is the second level, the urban dimension of care. And third is the dimension of the social economy of care. And so the fact that social production and social reproduction are central to the question. And I will end with a very small example, which I think is very relevant. The slogan of occupational therapy in the 40s and 30s in traditional psychiatry was that labor is therapeutical, which is very resonant with labor makes you free of the concentration camp logic. And in a sense, the fact was that social production could be therapeutical because it would discipline the body of the anormal to a normality of discipline and social production. Profoundly antagonistical to this logic is the logic of cooperation, of social cooperation. And so the fact that if we talk about social cooperatives, we talk of a common enterprises of social reproduction of a body that is diverse and needs to be taken care on a different level. Again, a very small example. When I was contracted my cooperative, in my contract, in the contract that I signed, was explicitly mentioned the fact that one of the most important duty of my work and everybody else work in my cooperative was taking care of my colleagues, because the inclusion and the construction of a cooperative practice is not just an economical one, but also a social one. So these are the three levels that works on the bottom-up vector, which are expression, urban intervention, and a social reproduction of care. I want to close with the situation right now. Right now, there is a profound attack on the system in Trieste, which is from 1 week ago. So we are still very unclear on what is the strategy to build, but which aims to dismantle completely this system. Is a very radical right-wing attack, which comes in a moment in which paradoxically both the WHO, the World Health Organization, and the Italian government have recognized the system of Trieste as one of the best in the world, and have guaranteed economical resources to support this kind of intervention in Italy and in Europe and in the world. Nonetheless, there is a strong attack to dismantle it because I would say this is a model that is against the idea of private profit. One of the founders of this story, in a short conversation we were having a few days ago, was telling me a sentence, a small thing that really struck me. He was saying to me, if we don't have the practice, if we are not doing, we cannot say nothing. We cannot tell the story if it's not happening. If I tell you the story and this is not happening anymore, this becomes a fantasy. While if it's happening, I can tell you the story and then we can enter into the contradiction, in all the complexity, in all the problems that all these instituent practices come with. So I think that this idea that there is no word to tell the story if this story is not happening is a crucial one, because I think that we have to think that the instituent practice is necessarily also a conceptual intervention, elaboration, and effort, but cannot happen without a practice. And I close with a sentence of Bertolt Brecht I was reading a few days ago in the book of Nel libro delle svolte. I don't know the title in English, in which Brecht says il pensiero viene dopo le difficoltà e prima dell'azione. So thinking comes after problems and before action. I think that we have to locate our practice of thinking, our abstract and conceptual practice, exactly in this moment, between danger and action, between danger and social transformation. So I hope that I've been making some sense. I'm sorry I was very fast, I realized in my speech, but I hope that you can help me to find a way of getting through this that is useful also to you, and not just to me. For me to speak is always a way of trying to order some disordered things. So Valeria, I give you back the the word.
Hey, I'm here. I was still thinking with you. Thank you so much. Also briefly, I think Brecht's book you were referring to in English is should be Metti, the Book of Interventions, which is a great read for anyone who would ever like to join you in your readings. Yes, so much to say. Thank you so much. I definitely have a few remarks, comments, and questions, but I would like maybe to see if anybody else wants to go first. So we open up a bit the group space, and maybe, I don't know, I would invite some faces to appear, see if technology supports us. If that's a good idea, because I know it is very hard for the speaker not to have a sense of mood and bodies and expressions. Thanks.
But sorry, Valeria, my connection goes unstable if you connect
Are you
everybody
sure about
with,
that? Yeah? Okay.
Because
Well, then
exactly
let's do a compromise. Whoever wants to maybe chip in will do so with the camera on.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so I see a hand up from Mark.
Yeah, hi everybody. I was really interested. I work in London, in the UK. I was interested in the discussion about microenvironment. The 57-year-old man that lived on the 5th floor, mildly depressed, etc., etc. How was that coordinated in terms of the various services working together as one to support that gentleman? Because in England, that would be very different. That would be a real challenge to get everyone to talk to each other. And who would manage the budget? Thank you.
Yeah, you are touching exactly on the two levels of difficulty. How do you make people from different institutions to talk to each other
And give up their power. And give up their power and their status. Yeah.
And who makes who puts the money in. So on the first dimension, there is two levels. On the one hand, the fact that there is at certain point, because of the Basaglian political intervention in the institutional level, there is an agreement between the three institutions to develop this integrated intervention. And so the mandate is a mandate that is given from the three institutions together, from the social housing company, the local authority, and the healthcare system. But on the other hand, there is a local, a situated dimension of it, so that one person from each of the institution works in the same place every day, and has a number of clear points of reference in the three institutions. And on this, another level comes in, so that the director of each of these three institutions gives bonus, economic bonus, to those mid-workers that really collaborate with these people that works in the neighborhood, but also the fact that the people that works in the neighborhood knows everybody that is in the neighborhood, so that they know their real life, and they can elaborate, because they also know how the system works, they can elaborate, okay, what is the kind of connection we can build? And economically, the question is that this kind of intervention, in the moment in which you build an infrastructure, an administrative infrastructure that builds pockets, interconnected pockets, becomes much more effective, economically efficient. Because, for example, if you think a bed in a hospital costs around 400–500 euros per day. If you do, but there you have all the devices at disposal of a body that in that moment might need one of these disposal. If you are able to transfer that one dispositive in that one device in the housing, in the house of a person, and so that the healthcare system just put 1 hour a day of a nurse, and the social system put 2 hours to clean the place, and etc., etc., etc. This becomes efficient, economically much more efficient. This is also being recognized by the WHO as a very good model. It's common sense, I would say. But it starts from necessarily from a top-down recognition and imposition, and from that invention of an institutional threshold, interstice, you say interstice, between the institution, like a space that is common to the two institutions, in which there is a, it's called a care budget. So it's a budget of care, which is filled with money from the three different institutions. Now they are also dismantling this, because if you dismantle this, then you can externalize it to private sector, which will be happy to do it, not in the same way though. So for example, just to give you a sense, in the last 10 years in which this model has been existing, 15, in those neighborhoods that were the more frail, the demand, the capacity of accessing to public funding of the people has increased dramatically. So people that before was not aware of what were their rights, what public funds were available, and so on, now are accessing to that, because there is a social worker that is with them and tells them, I will take you to the local authority and ask with you that funding that you need to buy the stove and to not freeze in your house.
I mean, it's interesting because in the UK they've said that if everybody claimed what they're entitled to regards benefits, the system would collapse. People don't know what they're entitled to. But my follow-up question was about what you've just touched on, which was about if it's cost effective, why is there a right-wing attack? Is that because they want to monetize and make profit? Because the model must be so cost effective, like you just outlined eloquently. So it can only be monetized. They just want to make a profit. Yeah, simple as that.
I think that's the only logical response to that.
Yeah.
You have to think that in the rest of the regions of in Italy where there is not this model, the 20% of the public money of healthcare goes directly to the private sector. In Friuli Venezia Giulia, in our region, is the 3%. So there is a gap of 14–15%, which is not going to the private sector. And obviously, the logic there is that the possibility of the private sector is that of building another economy. That's the logic. The logic of it would be that you produce another virtuosity of the multiplication of resources of Keynesian memory. But that is where it is interesting to think about social cooperatives as a private social agent that can work in the mid between the society and the institution, so that you can also answer to that logic of private, of a certain agility and dynamic capacity of the private sector, which obviously is a problem in the public institutions.
Just to say, your speech was absolutely fine. It was very logical. I understood it all. It's fine.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pantxo.
Thank you for the question.
Is there anyone else who would like to make yourself known? okay, so maybe maybe I can share some of what I've been thinking, Pantxo, listening to you. There's something that I'm trying to think about in terms of also the project that I'm writing on and researching for the fellowship, which has to do with the illegalisms of the plebs and this attitude of tinkering with institutions when they become dysfunctional, to put it briefly. And I'm thinking about the question of bureaucracy, also in terms of bureaucratization as one of the aspects of institutions, right? And I know that it's a hugely kind of conceptualized term, and there's different traditions of thinking around what is the bureaucratic element and what does it do. I was thinking, for example, recently I heard this talk by a Nigerian philosopher, Bayo Komolafe, and he was saying that, for example, bureaucracy could also be a way to discuss whiteness, and not so much around the problem of skin, but really if we are to abandon this fiction of races existing, then we need to conceptualize what are we talking about in a different way. And he was saying, like, how whiteness can be thought as a planetary attempt to produce spaces where subjects can function within smooth, impersonal, decontextualized bureaucracies. And I don't know, it really stayed with me because I think it names a big problem of this imaginary citizen subject that is totally bureaucratized. And so when I was listening to you talking, what seems to me super interesting, and I guess my question is just an open one to hear more around how this, what internal dispositives are put in place to fight this sclerotization into bureaucracy of the institution. You were speaking of it in terms of making it vulnerable all the time, and you did mention your contract having this element of also having a duty of care to your fellow workers, or maybe rather than duty of care, we should think of it more as a recognition of the labor of care that you will put towards your colleagues, and I suppose vice versa. Yeah, so I wonder if you have more thoughts on this subject, just broadly. Sorry, I'm a bad question person because I never have a very specific one, but I just like the conversation. So.
Yeah, I mean, what we are seeing in these days is that there is a lot of so the violence of the attack, for example, also goes through the bureaucratization of processes. Just to make you a very quick example, right now there is I call it an internal order to the workers of the public institution for which they cannot speak publicly about the social service, the services that they are providing. They cannot talk with the population on media, for example, on the problems that they see, if not as union on their labor problems, but they cannot criticize the working of the institution. And workers are worried and scared about this. This was very different in the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s, in which this would have been a space of fight, and probably there would have been also an attempt of organizing politically and go in this conflict, in a sense, not try to get you fired for something like that and open a conflict out of that. Right now there is not only a sclerotization of bureaucracy, but also fragility, vulnerability of the people that is amazing, the level of pressure, of precarization, etc., etc. One of the things that makes me a little bit positive, optimist, is the fact that still there is a presence of non-institutional dispositives of political organization through the technical, so that there are informal spaces in which people discuss out of their roles, and out of their roles they can tell like, for example, we have been organizing these assemblies in these last months, and there were a very strong conversation between users and psychiatrists on the way in which services were provided, in which people from the user side were saying the level of care right now is shit because of this and that and that, and a psychiatrist would respond saying, "You are totally right, and I totally listen to you, but also you must know that the precarization of our work is this, this, and that." And was very powerful to me to be on a circle and sharing these different points of view on the same object that is a common good, which is not me taking care of you, my duty of care towards you, but the fact that this possibility of care is a common good and needs to be, and we need to be aware of the fragility of each other. But this is hyper fragile as a model, and the assembly that was of 150 people just 6 months ago is now 30 people. Nonetheless, I think that this is the only tool that we have at our disposal in order to find a way to attempt resistance and also a reinvention, because we cannot resist defending what we have, because what we have is collapsing. We need to reinvent care in these days, and I think that the practice of Basaglian movement in the last 50 years is interesting in the archive, for example, because you don't see a linear story. You see a number of crises, a number of debates. There are 40 different editorial projects of fanzines of discussion, and you can see how each of them is done of 3 or 4 numbers and then collapses because the problem are different, and we need to rethink our editorial project in order to keep discussing together. So in this sense, also the sistering that we were thinking for the reason machines with you and Tommy and Marcel and the school will go in that sense of inventing new editorial project. And I think editorial means also the fact that we are editing society. We are not transforming society in general. We have to edit it as if it was a text in which we have to find the right words, the right construction of the sentence that makes it clearer, that works better. So it's a tinkering and an editing. So I like this image of the editing. I always been fascinated by the way in which you write a text and then you ask somebody to edit it. And the fact of this discussion and this dialogue with a person that is external to you and works with your works, with your words, allows you to see all the problems that your text is living with. And this is something also very important for me in my practice of translation, where you're translating a text, even your text, you are obliged to, you are forced to go into it and find what doesn't work in that. So I think that we have to do that kind of practices.
Yeah. Thank you. Is there energy for maybe one more question before we say goodbye? I would just invite whoever wants to come live or. Marco Luca, would you like to say anything, or?
Katarina has a question.
Katarina.
Okay, thank you. Did I miss that? Ah, yes.
I'm not going to test it with the camera. I just wanted to say thank you for such an interesting talk. Yeah, I don't really have a question, except that it was really fascinating to listen to you. And that I hope that, you know, we're close to that. I hope that we can also see some of these practices in action in Trieste. So not so much of a question, but just a thank you.
You are one of the things that Basaglian used to say was, so I will just copy him, was come and see, because, and he was saying, because I am telling you stories that might change from one day to the other. And I think right now you should come and see, but especially come and help us, because the situation is very difficult, and the possibility of having people coming through and giving us feedback on what's going on is very important. So I know there is no Flixbus anymore from Rijeka to Trieste, because I was trying to come to Rijeka today and it was impossible. But if you come, we will be very happy to welcome you and show you around. And if you want to stay a few days and help us to do small projects, really the possibility of building, experimenting with small stuff is necessary and very useful to us.
Hi, is that Branka? Would you like to maybe have a comment or question? You're muted, so we can't hear you. Branka, we can't hear you. You need to unmute.
Hi everyone. It was really interesting. Thank you. And I'm just thinking about visiting. So yeah. Well, it's a mess of my thoughts now at the moment. So I think I will continue talking with Valeria about this. So thank you for sure.
Good. And yes, and maybe we were saying before during the coffee break that in January or early February I could try to come to Rijeka and keep on with this conversation. But obviously you are more than welcome to come.
Yeah. Well, I would say just one thing, like through artistic practice, I experienced at the beginning of your talk, you were mentioning that structures and influences within urban areas, which are kind of reflection towards society. And I remember my experience in New York facing that kind of combination and learning about that historic existence of that practice. So that was for me, that was a really interesting reminder of how we should maintain those systems which are already existing, let's say. Yeah. Lots of thoughts. Sorry, I'm not focused very well. So.
I mean, I think that the role of the artistic practice here was crucial. First was, and I think there are two different phases, which I think is interesting to mention briefly. One is the moment in which artists come to organize artistic practices in order to produce a different logic of communication. But then there is this moment in which the possibility of building atelier in the former asylum produces an energy, a connection, an energy that I think was absolutely crucial to the development of an artistic movement here.
Yeah, true. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, perhaps the art angle will be a good one to explore in another context, because I know there's so much there, but all these great histories that change with context and time. I would imagine that this is a good time perhaps to thank you, Pantxo, and let you go on with the day. And yeah, I think thanks for pushing through the technological issues, everyone.
I'm sorry again for the initial breakdown, but I think that in the end it worked. I think that this camera echo chamber that was at certain point in which I was just talking with myself in the screen was at least useful to maintain a quality of the transmission.
Yeah, and as you said, I think proximity is such a gift, so we can try and explore what that brings in the future. Yeah, I think we might have one more meeting as fellows this year, and but I know we're all kind of happy to see the end of the cycle closing and see what happens in this world. Yeah, so thank you very much. We'll be in touch in various configurations, I suppose.
Thank you very much, and I hope that when I come there, I can listen more of your work and maybe still some of your ideas and practices to bring them back to Trieste.
We need to do it on the island. We will bring you on the island, and the Odysseys, you will reach your Ithaca and you will enjoy it. So don't worry.
I'm always easy to come on islands. I love islands.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you, Valeria. Thank you, Pantxo.
Thank you very much. Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Ciao.
Ciao, ciao, ciao.